All right, buckle up everybody, because today we're going way back in time on a quest to uncover the historical Jesus, to separate the man from the myth. And to help us on this journey, we've got this amazing lecture from a historian and archaeologist, someone who really knows their stuff when it comes to ancient Rome. So get ready, because what we're about to uncover might just challenge some preconceived notions.
It is a fascinating journey, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, even starting with the most basic question, right? Did Jesus even exist?
You know, it's funny. It's easy to just take that as a given, but when you really look at the evidence, it's actually quite compelling. Most historians, and I'm talking about historians of all backgrounds, even those who aren't religious, they tend to agree that a historical Jesus did walk the earth. And one of the arguments for this that I find really interesting is this concept of historical economy. So think about it. Back in the first century, imagine trying to invent a figure from scratch. Someone as complex and as influential as Jesus. I mean, it would be like trying to start a wildfire with a single spark. It's just incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
It's far more plausible from a historical perspective to think that there was a real person there. A preacher who gained a following, and whose life and teachings were later embellished and expanded upon.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? It's like you're starting with the real seed instead of trying to conjure a whole tree out of thin air. So speaking of evidence, what about the Gospels themselves? Did they support the idea of a real person with, flaws and all?
Absolutely, they do. If you look closely, the Gospels actually portray Jesus with very human characteristics. He gets angry, he feels frustrated. There are even moments where he seems to doubt. These aren't exactly the traits of a perfectly crafted mythical being. They point to a real person, someone wrestling with complex emotions and challenges.
So in a way, those imperfections actually make him more believable, more human. That's so interesting. Okay, so let's say we accept that there was a historical Jesus. Who was he really? What can we actually say about him beyond the stories and interpretations?
Well, based on what we can piece together from the sources, it seems like Jesus was this radical, nationalistic Jewish preacher operating in first century Galilee. And here's something that might surprise you. He was actually one of many similar preachers active at the time. His core belief, which was the imminent arrival of the kingdom of God on earth, this was a pretty common theme among Jewish preachers back then. But what seems to have set Jesus apart, at least in part, was his focus on the reunification of the 12 tribes of Israel as a prerequisite for this kingdom to arrive. And this wasn't just some abstract idea to him either. I mean, the fact that he chose 12 apostles, which directly mirrors the 12 tribes, shows just how deeply ingrained this belief was in his worldview and in his mission.
Wow, that's a connection I'd never really thought about before. It really highlights the specific historical and political context, right? The world that Jesus was operating in. But it also kind of makes you wonder, if this message about the kingdom of God was so common back then, why did Jesus in particular become such a pivotal figure?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's a question that we'll definitely keep digging into as we go further down this rabbit hole.
For sure. But before we go there, is there any evidence for Jesus' existence outside of the Bible and the Gospels? Because I think if we're trying to get a clearer picture of the historical Jesus, it's important to look at sources beyond just the ones written by his followers, right?
Exactly. And we actually do have a few accounts from Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius. They mention Jesus, though pretty briefly. But perhaps the most interesting source is Flavius Josephus. He was a Jewish historian who lived in the first century, and his work, which is known as the Testimonium Flavianum, offers a glimpse of Jesus from a non-Christian perspective.
But, these Roman historians, they wrote their accounts decades after Jesus died, right? Couldn't their texts have been altered or influenced by Christians over time?
You're right to be skeptical. That's where this whole concept of interpolations comes in. It's the idea that later Christian copyists might have, tweaked these texts a bit to kind of align them more with their developing beliefs. And as an example, Josephus's account, it includes phrases that paint Jesus in a more divine light. And some scholars believe that those were probably added later.
So how do we even begin to sort out those potential additions from the original text? It sounds like a real historical puzzle.
It is. It really is. And it's a puzzle that scholars are still trying to solve to this day. But even with these potential interpolations, the fact that these non-Christian sources mention Jesus at all, it lends more weight, to the idea that he was indeed a real historical figure.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer of evidence to the mix. But this brings up another point that I think is really important to address. We often hear the names Jesus and Christ used interchangeably, right? But are they really the same thing?
That's a crucial distinction to make. The historical Jesus, the radical Jewish preacher we've been talking about, is distinct from the later constructed figure of Christ, or Jesus Christ. And this transformation, from man to Messiah, from a figure rooted in Jewish tradition to one with more universal appeal, that's a whole other story in itself.
So what was it that sparked this shift? How did the historical Jesus become the Christ of faith?
Well, a key figure in this transformation was Paul. He was a Jew who was educated in Greek thought. And actually, he started out persecuting Christians. But then he came to recognize that for this message of the kingdom of God to reach a wider audience, it needed to appeal to Gentiles, that is, non-Jews. And this realization led to a kind of reframing of Jesus, blending the man with more divine attributes, creating a figure who could resonate across cultural and religious boundaries.
So it sounds like Paul was kind of like a master strategist, right?
Yeah.
Recognizing that the message needed to adapt for a new audience. It's fascinating how these historical figures, and their decisions really shape the entire trajectory of a religion.
It's true. It shows how individual actions can intertwine with these larger historical forces. And this interplay becomes even more apparent as we start looking at the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We often think of them as straightforward biographies of Jesus' life. But the reality is a bit more complicated than that. For starters, none of them were actually written by eyewitnesses or, during Jesus' lifetime. They were all composed decades after his death. With Mark, the earliest one, dating back to around 70 AD, which, if you remember in Roman history, it was after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem.
Oh, that's right. So if Mark was written after the temple's destruction, that means that whole prophecy about it in the gospel, it couldn't have really been a prophecy, could it?
Exactly. It kind of suggests that the Gospels are, well, at least in part, more like theological interpretations of events, shaped by the beliefs and experiences of those early Christian communities. They offer us these valuable insights into how Jesus was understood and remembered. But they might not be, a completely historically accurate or objective account.
Huh, yeah. That makes you think twice about the reliability of, everything in there, doesn't it? So if Mark was the earliest, what about the other Gospels? How do they fit in?
So both Matthew and Luke, which were written somewhere between 80 and 90 AD, they seem to have used Mark as a source, along with this hypothetical Q source, basically a collection of Jesus' sayings that unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. And then there's John, the last gospel written. That one came about around 90 to 100 AD, and it presents a much more, mystical and theologically developed picture of Jesus.
So it's like we had these different layers of interpretation, development within the Gospels themselves. It's almost like watching a story evolve over time. Like with each retelling, you get new nuances and perspectives.
Yeah, exactly. And that idea of, evolving narratives is super important when we start talking about, the crucifixion. We often hear this narrative that the Jews were solely responsible for Jesus' death. But that interpretation is something that we should definitely examine a bit more closely.
You're saying that we need to reframe our understanding of the crucifixion.
Exactly, because, the crucifixion wasn't just some isolated incident. It was a Roman execution, a really brutal punishment that they used to put down rebellions and, just maintain order. And ultimately, it was the Roman authorities, specifically Pontius Pilate, who was the governor of Judea at the time. He was the one who condemned Jesus to death.
So the Romans saw Jesus as like a threat to their power.
Yes.
Yeah.
You have to remember, Jesus was preaching about the coming of the kingdom of God, a kingdom that would, completely challenge the existing political and social order. So it's very likely that Pilate interpreted this as sedition, basically opposition to Roman rule. And it's really important to remember this. Crucifixion itself was a Roman punishment, not a Jewish one.
Wow, this is really changing the whole narrative,
Yeah.
grew up hearing.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting? It's quite possible that this blame shifting, attributing Jesus' death solely to the Jews, was something that was done by later Christians to try and make their religion more palatable to potential Roman converts.
Right. I can see how that would make sense from a strategic perspective, but it's pretty disturbing to think about the lasting consequences of that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this framing of the crucifixion has fueled centuries of anti-Semitism, a really dark and painful chapter in history. It just shows how interpretations of the past can have a real and sometimes really harmful impact on the present.
This is some heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But it's definitely important to talk about it, to confront these uncomfortable truths. Okay, so moving on to something else that's been a source of much debate, I think. What about the resurrection? Was it a physical event, a spiritual one? What do we know?
Well, that's a question that people have been grappling with for centuries, right? And the resurrection story itself, it actually kind of evolves as you read through the Gospels, becoming more elaborate and, well, miraculous with each telling. It starts with what was probably the most likely scenario. Jesus, like others who were crucified, was buried in a common grave, inaccessible to his followers. And this lack of closure, the inability to really mourn and properly bury their leader, that could have easily fueled the initial belief that he was still alive, in some form, at least in spirit.
So you're saying the resurrection might have started as more of a spiritual experience, like a belief in Jesus' continued presence, rather than a literal physical event?
It's definitely a possibility. But then as the story develops in the later Gospels, the physical resurrection becomes more solidified, I guess you could say. Though even then, there are these variations and inconsistencies in the accounts. That kind of suggests a developing narrative rather than, a single undisputed event.
So the resurrection, like so much of Jesus' story, is kind of this complex tapestry woven from historical threads, theological interpretations, and personal beliefs.
Exactly. And that complexity, it just intensifies as we shift our focus from Jesus himself to the rise of Christianity. I mean, it's pretty amazing to think how this small, relatively insignificant movement back in Jesus' time could eventually become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. And well beyond.
Yeah, it's truly a remarkable transformation. I remember, learning about the early Christians being persecuted, thrown to the lions, martyred for their faith. Was that a big factor in their eventual success?
Well, that image of this constant, widespread persecution of early Christians, it's actually more myth than reality.
Really, I always pictured them as this small, embattled group facing constant danger.
Yeah, it's a powerful narrative, but it doesn't really line up with the historical evidence we have. For most of the 1st and 2nd centuries, Christians were just this small, somewhat peculiar sect within the vast Roman Empire. They weren't really on anyone's radar enough to, warrant any kind of systematic persecution.
So if it wasn't martyrdom that fueled Christianity's rise, what was it then?
Well, a pretty pivotal moment came with the Edict of Galerius in 311 AD. This edict was issued by a Roman emperor, and it actually reveals that Rome's main issue with the Christians wasn't really their beliefs. It was their refusal to participate in the civic rituals and sacrifices, which were seen as, essential for the well-being of the empire.
Oh, so the Romans were more concerned with, social cohesion, maintaining their traditions, than they were with stamping out a new religion.
Exactly. They saw this Christian refusal as a sign of disloyalty, a potential threat to the empire's stability. And in a way, this edict, not the widespread martyrdom, set the stage for Emperor Constantine's acceptance of Christianity just a few years later.
Constantine, the emperor who made Christianity the official religion of Rome. That was a huge turning point.
Oh, absolutely. It marked a dramatic shift in the relationship between Christianity and the Roman Empire. But it's important to remember that, Constantine didn't just convert the entire empire overnight. It was a gradual process with a lot of different factors contributing to Christianity's eventual success. Yeah, it really was a pivotal moment in history. But it wasn't just Constantine, right?
So what else contributed to Christianity becoming, so widespread? What were some of the other factors?
It was a bunch of things, really, a perfect storm, you could say. But I think one key thing was this. message of universal salvation Christianity, unlike a lot of other religions at the time, it offered hope and redemption to everyone, no matter their social status, wealth, or background. It was pretty revolutionary, actually, in a society that was so focused on these rigid hierarchies. Just imagine, right? A belief system that says, hey, you, a slave, are just as worthy of salvation as the emperor himself.
Wow, yeah. That inclusiveness must have been incredibly appealing, especially for people who felt marginalized or, oppressed.
Oh, absolutely. It was a game changer. And then there's the strength of the Christian community, too. They were all about supporting each other, offering practical help, emotional support, and a sense of belonging. It was like this built-in social safety net, especially in times of hardship or uncertainty.
It makes sense that people would gravitate towards that, especially in a world that could feel so chaotic and unpredictable.
Totally. Christianity offered a haven, a sense of purpose, and a promise of something better, both in this life and the next. It was a potent mix that really resonated with people across the Roman Empire and, well, eventually far beyond.
It's pretty amazing to think about, right? How this movement that started with a handful of followers in first century Judea, it spread across continents and basically shaped the course of history. So we've talked about a lot today, from the historical Jesus to the rise of Christianity. What are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
I'd say the most important thing is to remember that the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, they're two different things. The historical Jesus, he was a radical Jewish preacher who lived and died. In a very specific historical context, the Christ of faith, on the other hand, he's a figure who has been interpreted and reinterpreted over centuries, shaped by theological beliefs, by cultural influences, and by personal experiences.
It's like we've been looking at this famous painting for years, and finally, now we're getting a chance to step behind the canvas and see the individual brushstrokes, all the layers of paint that create the image we know so well.
I love that analogy, and understanding that distinction, between the historical figure and the theological construct, it can really open up new ways of understanding Christianity and its impact on the world.
And it reminds us that historical context is so important too. We can't really understand the story of Jesus or the rise of Christianity without understanding the politics, the society, the religious landscape of the first century Roman Empire.
Absolutely. Context is everything. And I guess one final thought I'd add is it's important to remember that the development of Christianity wasn't this neat and tidy process. It was messy, full of internal disagreements, evolving narratives. It was complicated. It's a human story with all the complexities and contradictions that come with that.
And it's a story that continues to unfold today, isn't it? With different groups interpreting and reinterpreting the life and teachings of Jesus. It makes you realize that history isn't static, It's a living thing that's constantly being shaped and reshaped by new discoveries, perspectives, and interpretations.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I encourage everyone listening to keep exploring this story, to question assumptions, dig into the evidence, and ultimately form your own conclusions.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history and you're hungry for more, make sure you subscribe to the What Science is Hiding from You podcast and the Viral Impact AI channel.
Leave us a comment, share this episode with your friends, and let's keep the conversation going.
Until next time, keep diving deep.